All right, let's dive deep into Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. This book, it's not just a story about surviving concentration
It is
camps.
not.
It's really about finding meaning in life, even when things get incredibly tough. You know,
Exactly.
like how do we find that strength, that purpose when everything seems hopeless?
Well, Frankl, he was a psychiatrist,
Yeah?
and he experienced the horrors of the camps firsthand.
Yeah.
And from those experiences, he developed just a powerful perspective on the human spirit, I think.
It's amazing. Even Gordon Allport, the psychologist who wrote the preface, he was totally captivated by Frankl's approach.
Yeah.
He even mentions how Frankl would ask his patients, these suffering patients, why do you not commit suicide?
Uh,
Like, wow.
it seems like such a jarring question,
Right.
but it actually helped him understand what kept them going.
Yeah.
Really. Like, what was that little spark?
Yeah.
It could be anything, family, some hidden talent they had,
Sure.
even just their cherished memories.
Yeah.
And Frankl believed we could take these little threads and weave them into like a tapestry of meaning, right?
Yeah.
Which is just, I think, incredible.
So powerful. And Allport also describes how Frankl lost, well, everything.
He did.
His family, his possessions, his manuscript.
Everything. Stripped
It
bare.
was all gone. He was reduced to a number. It's hard to even imagine.
I know, it really challenges our assumptions about human endurance, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Frankl himself said, an abnormal reaction to an abnormal situation is normal behavior.
It makes you think, right? So his reactions to the camps, however strange they seem to us now, were actually normal considering the situation.
Exactly.
Yet horrific situation.
You have to remember the context, right?
Right.
And it's within this framework that Frankl outlines the phases of a prisoner's psychological experience in the camps.
Okay, so let's talk about those phases. Starting with the initial shock of entering the camp, the finger game, right?
The finger game.
That selection process where guards would just point left or right.
It's just, yeah. To decide who lived and who went straight to the crematorium.
Immediately. Just like that.
Just like that.
Frankl describes arriving with other prisoners and, they're clinging to whatever possessions they had left.
Right, clinging to
A watch.
a photograph, anything.
Anything. Just desperate to hold on to some sense of their former life.
Right, some normalcy.
But then it was all brutally stripped away.
Yeah, and he even tried to save his manuscript.
Yeah.
His life's work, he's holding on to it.
Yeah.
Until a guard just yells, shit.
Shit.
And he said that's when he just mentally struck out his whole former life.
That's the moment, yeah.
That was the moment he realized there was just no room for sentimentality anymore.
Wow.
He had to focus solely on the present moment to survive.
It's just unimaginable. And this leads into that second phase.
Yeah.
Apathy. It almost sounds like an emotional death.
It was a way of adapting, right?
Yeah.
Frankl observed prisoners sleeping soundly,
Yeah.
despite the noise, the discomfort, maintaining gum health even without basic hygiene.
Right.
It's just, amazing.
Yeah.
Their minds and bodies found ways to cope.
Yeah. It's incredible and terrifying to think about. He talks about how the thought of suicide almost became irrelevant
Right.
because death was a constant threat anyway.
It was just, ever present.
Right. And there's that anecdote where he was told he was the only one who should fear the next selection, and he just smiled.
Oh, wow.
Like,
I know, it really speaks to that emotional detachment. We were talking about, feeling the full weight of that situation might have just been unbearable.
Yeah.
So,
It's a defense mechanism in a way.
absolutely.
Okay, so then comes liberation.
Yeah.
That moment of freedom they all longed for. I mean, you'd think it would just be pure joy, right?
You would think that, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But Frankl describes it as this really muted experience.
Really?
He walked through a field of flowers, and he just felt numb. He said he only found a tiny spark of joy when he saw, of all things, a rooster.
A rooster.
A rooster.
Wow.
And he calls this depersonalization. It just felt so unreal after years of yearning for it.
It's almost like waking up from a long, terrible dream.
Exactly. And there's a physical reaction, too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he describes this just overwhelming urge to eat ravenously,
Oh, sure.
to talk endlessly, just releasing years of, pent-up emotions.
Years of it, yeah. He paints this really vivid picture of himself kneeling in a vast field.
Does he?
Yeah, feeling the freedom of space, and he's praying, and he says, I called to the Lord from my narrow prison, and he answered me in the freedom of space.
It's a beautiful image.
Yeah.
But, regaining feeling, like really reconnecting with the world.
Yeah.
It's a process. Frankl calls this decompression sickness, like what deep-sea divers experience when they surface too quickly.
Right.
That sudden release of pressure, it can be really harmful.
Harmful, yeah. He even tells this story about a liberated prisoner who insisted on trampling crops.
Oh, wow.
And he's justifying it because of all the suffering he'd endured.
I see.
Like, I suffered, now it's your turn. It's a strange,
It's troubling, isn't it?
yeah, very troubling.
It raises a profound ethical question.
Yeah.
How do we prevent suffering from breeding more suffering?
Right.
How do we break that cycle?
How do we heal? So we've talked about these different phases of the concentration camp experience,
Okay.
but the core of Frankl's book is about finding meaning in that suffering.
Absolutely. And that's where his concept of logotherapy comes in.
Okay.
And it revolves around this core idea. Humans, we are driven by a search for meaning.
Okay, so that's different from, say, Freud's focus on pleasure.
It's a different perspective. Frankl believes meaning is a primary motivator for us.
Okay.
I mean, his famous quote, it really sums it up. He who has a why to live for can bear with almost anyhow.
That's so true. And not just in extreme situations like the camps, but in everyday life too, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Like, if we have a strong enough why, a purpose,
If you know why you're doing something.
we can face really difficult situations with more resilience.
Exactly, yeah.
And Frankl, he even rewrote his lost manuscript in the camp.
He did, yeah.
And the act itself, the writing, it became this life-affirming force for
And
him.
to give him purpose. Yeah.
Exactly. It's about finding that drive within, that will to meaning. But it's not about, actively seeking out suffering, right?
Yeah, I know.
It's not like
It's not about that. It's about recognizing that suffering is a part of life
yeah.
and finding meaning within those hardships,
Right.
those hardships that are unavoidable.
Yeah, that are going to happen. He calls this tension between who we are and who we could be. New dynamics, I think, is the word. Yeah.
And suggests it's actually a healthy thing.
So instead of avoiding discomfort, we should lean into that tension.
In a way, yeah. It's about having goals,
Right. Yeah.
aspirations, something to strive for.
Having that purpose. Yeah.
Yeah. Without that, we fall into what Frankl calls the existential vacuum, which is this feeling of emptiness and lack of purpose.
Right.
That, unfortunately is really prevalent today.
Oh, I think we've all felt that existential vacuum at some point.
Have we?
Yeah, it's like this sense of meaninglessness.
Yeah.
Like, what's the point?
Exactly. And Frankl suggested it became more common in the 20th century with the decline of traditional values and just increased uncertainty in the world.
Yeah, makes sense. And he also argues that always equating happiness with mental health can be, well, dangerous.
Yeah.
It can set us up for disappointment because life includes suffering, right?
Perhaps it does.
It's not always going to be rainbows and butterflies. So instead of constantly chasing happiness, we should be asking ourselves, like Frankl says, what does life expect from me?
Exactly, right? It's a much more powerful question.
It is. It shifts our focus away from, our own needs all the time. Right.
And towards, contributing something.
Contributing to something bigger than ourselves.
Yeah, responsibility, purpose.
Absolutely.
And he also reminds us that each person's suffering is unique, so comparisons are pointless.
Yeah.
We each have our own path to walk, our own challenges to overcome.
We do. And, he tells this really poignant story about a young woman who's dying in the camp.
Yeah.
And she finds solace in a chestnut tree.
Okay.
She imagines the tree saying to her, I am here. I am here. I am life, eternal life.
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know, it's really powerful.
It gives me chills. Even in the face of death, she found a connection to something bigger than herself.
That's it. That's it.
That's meaning.
Exactly.
It really is. It's a powerful reminder that meaning can exist even in the darkest of places.
Yeah.
And it brings us back to Frankl's concept of new dynamics.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on that a bit more? I think it's a concept a lot of people might struggle with.
Absolutely. Imagine like a rubber band.
Okay.
When it's stretched, there's tension, right?
Yeah. Energy.
Yeah.
That's new dynamics. The tension between like what we are now and what we could become, the goals that we strive for. Frankl believed this tension is healthy. It propels us forward.
So without that tension, without goals, we're like a limp rubber band.
Exactly.
Just lying there.
We fall into that existential vacuum, that sense of emptiness, lack of purpose. And I think, that's something a lot of people can relate to, especially in our modern world.
It's interesting because Frankl he actually identified 3 specific ways we can find meaning, right?
He did.
He talks about creative work,
Yeah.
experiencing beauty and love,
Mm-hmm.
and our attitude toward unavoidable suffering.
Right. The first two, they're kind of more intuitive, I think.
Yeah.
Creative work, it gives us a sense of accomplishment, like Frankl rewriting his manuscript in the camp
Yeah.
and experiencing beauty,
Right.
whether it's in nature, art, human connection, it brings joy and richness to our lives.
Sure.
But it's that third one, finding meaning in suffering. That's the one that really challenges us.
Yeah, it does. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Frankl isn't saying that we should seek out suffering
No.
or that it's inherently good.
No, not at all.
He's saying that when we face unavoidable suffering, we can choose how we respond to it.
Exactly.
So it's not about the suffering itself, but our attitude towards it.
Precisely.
Yeah.
We can choose bitterness and despair, or we can choose to find meaning, to grow, to help others. It's like that, that young woman with the chestnut tree. She didn't deny the reality of her suffering, but she found something, transcendent within it.
And Frankl also talks about freedom, which seems kind of paradoxical in the context of a concentration camp.
It is a paradox. But he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, that while we can't always choose our circumstances, we can choose our attitude towards them.
So even in the most restricted environment, there's still a degree of inner freedom.
Exactly, and that's where meaning comes in.
Okay.
Frankl, he challenges us to flip the script. Instead of asking, what's the meaning of life, we should ask, what is life asking of me?
Oh, I like that.
Right. It's about responsibility, about finding purpose in our actions, even when things are tough.
You got it. And one of the things I find most compelling about Frankl's work is his perspective on happiness.
Yeah.
He actually cautions against equating happiness with mental health.
Right, because it sets us up for disappointment, because life inevitably includes suffering. So instead of constantly chasing happiness, we should be asking, what does life expect from me?
That's such a powerful shift in focus. It moves us away from self-centeredness towards a sense of purpose and contribution.
And he reminds us that each person's suffering is unique, so comparisons are pointless. We each have our own path to walk, our own challenges to overcome.
We do. And, he shares this very personal story about struggling to find meaning when all hope seemed lost.
Yeah.
He found this torn page from a prayer book with the Shema Yisrael.
Okay.
It's a central Jewish prayer. And he interpreted this as a challenge to live his thoughts, not just write them down.
Wow.
So even in that darkness, he found that spark of purpose. It's incredibly inspiring.
It is. And then he raises this crucial question. Has all this suffering, this dying around us, a meaning? For if not, then ultimately there is no meaning to survival. For a life whose meaning depends upon such a happenstance as whether one escapes or not, ultimately would not be worth living at all.
So it's not just about surviving, it's about finding a reason to survive, even in the face of death.
Exactly. And from there, he kind of delves into what he calls metaclinical problems.
Okay.
Which are issues that go beyond traditional therapy, right?
Yeah.
And he spent years working with suicidal patients and noticed this common thread among them, a profound sense of meaninglessness.
So their attempt at suicide wasn't just about ending pain, but about escaping a life that just felt empty, without purpose.
Precisely. And he felt that if, even 1 in 1,000 people who attempt suicide could be saved by finding a reason to live, it would be worth it.
It's a powerful thought.
It is.
And he didn't shy away from these tough topics.
Bro, he didn't.
He also connected aggression to this lack of meaning.
Yeah. He cites this experiment where researchers were able to create aggression between groups of Boy Scouts.
Wow, really?
But then, when those same boys were given a shared purpose, a meaningful task, the aggression subsided.
It's amazing how a sense of purpose can change our behavior.
It is.
Yeah.
So drastically. And then there's addiction.
Right.
Another major issue that Frankl links to a lack of meaning. He observed that a significant percentage of alcoholics and drug addicts reported feeling deeply meaningless in their lives.
Like they're trying to fill that void with something, anything, even if it's ultimately destructive.
Exactly. They're desperately seeking something to give their lives meaning.
It all comes back to meaning.
It does. And this brings us back to the importance of finding meaning for our well-being, our resilience, even our physical health.
Our overall health.
Our overall health, exactly.
Yeah.
And Frankl emphasizes that finding meaning isn't like a one-time event,
Right.
He compares it to watching a movie. Each frame makes sense on its own. But the full meaning of the film only becomes clear at the end. Life's kind of like that. We're constantly unfolding, searching for meaning in each moment.
So we're always in process,
We are.
always seeking.
Always.
What a powerful concept. But there's another misconception that that Frankl addresses, that suffering is necessary for meaning,
Right, yeah.
which isn't true.
He makes a crucial distinction between avoidable and unavoidable suffering.
Yeah.
If suffering is avoidable, it's meaningful to remove its cause.
Right.
But when suffering is unavoidable, the meaning lies in how we choose to respond.
Okay, so he uses the example of Jerry Long, I think.
Yeah.
A man paralyzed from the neck down after a diving accident.
Terrible accident, yeah.
And Long, he chose to find meaning in his situation by helping others.
Right. It's a beautiful example of what Frankl calls tragic optimism.
Tragic optimism.
Even in the face of tragedy, we can choose hope. We can choose to find meaning and purpose. It's about recognizing our own agency, our own power to choose our attitude, even when things are tough.
This reminds me of that saying, life is 10% what happens to you and 90% how you react to it.
That's a great way to put it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we've covered a lot of ground here. Suffering, resilience, new dynamics, the importance of meaning.
Right.
But we haven't talked about guilt and death, the other two parts of what Frankl calls the tragic triad.
Okay, so guilt and death, those are heavy topics.
They are.
But also universal human experiences.
Absolutely.
I'm really curious to hear Frankl's perspective on them.
Yeah, me too.
Guilt and death, those are some heavy topics.
They are.
But also universal human experiences. I mean, we all deal with them.
Right, at some point.
I'm curious to hear Frankl's perspective on them.
Well, he approached these topics with his signature kind of blend of psychological insight and philosophical depth.
Right.
So let's start with guilt.
Okay.
Frankl was really intrigued by this theological concept of, I think it's mysterium iniquitatis.
Mysterium iniquitatis.
Yeah, the idea that a crime, a truly evil act, can't be fully explained away by, science or societal factors.
So it's about acknowledging the complexity of human choices. Right.
Exactly.
The fact that even when we try to understand all the influences that might lead someone to commit a crime.
Right. Their background, their environment.
Yeah.
All of that.
There's still this element of mystery.
There is.
To the act itself.
Exactly. To the choice,
Yeah.
And this ties into personal responsibility.
Okay.
Frankl, he believed that attempting to completely explain away a crime could actually dehumanize the individual.
Interesting.
It's like reducing them to a broken machine that needs fixing. Right.
Right.
Instead of recognizing their agency, their capacity for both good and bad.
So it's not about, letting people off the hook for their actions.
No, not at all.
It's about holding them accountable
It is.
while still recognizing their humanity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he even, he worked with prisoners at San Quentin, right?
Oh, wow.
Instead of just, absolving them of responsibility, he encouraged them to confront their guilt,
Yeah.
to rise above it through positive action.
So it's about redemption
It is.
rather than just punishment.
He saw redemption as much more powerful than punishment.
That must have been incredibly challenging work,
Oh, I'm sure it was.
but also deeply meaningful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And, Frankl was also a vocal critic of collective guilt.
Okay.
The idea of holding individuals responsible for the actions of others or entire groups of people.
Right, like blaming a whole group for the actions of a few.
Exactly. He saw that as unjust and ultimately unproductive.
There's that great anecdote where someone criticized him for writing his books in German.
Really?
Yeah, they called it Hitler's language.
Wow.
And Frankl countered by asking if they had knives in their kitchen. And when they said yes, he expressed shock. He's like, how could you use knives after so many murderers have used them to kill?
It's such a brilliant analogy.
It is.
Because it exposes the absurdity of blaming, a language or an entire group of people
Right.
for the actions of a few.
It's a good reminder to be mindful of generalizations and to focus on individual accountability.
Exactly.
Okay, so guilt. We've talked about guilt. What about death? I mean, it's something we all inevitably face. How did Frankl view this ultimate experience?
Well, he saw death not as an ending, but as a fundamental part of life.
Okay.
He reminds us that every moment we experience is fleeting, right? It's constantly dying and making way for the next moment.
It's like that saying, you can never step in the same river twice.
Exactly. And this is a powerful invitation to appreciate each moment.
Right.
Knowing that it's precious and it won't come again. He even suggests this thought experiment.
Yeah.
Live as if you were living for the second time and had acted as wrongly the first time, as you are about to act now.
Wow. That's a mouthful.
It is.
But it really makes you stop and think
Right.
about the choices you're making right now.
Exactly. It's about living with intentionality,
Yeah.
knowing that our time is limited. And Frankl argues that this awareness of death can actually enhance our opportunities to live meaningfully.
Okay, explain that.
Well, the very fact that our time is finite makes each action, each choice, more significant.
Right, because we don't have an unlimited amount of time to get things right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he also, he challenges this idea of pitying the elderly because they supposedly have fewer opportunities in the future.
Oh, interesting.
He actually suggests that young people should envy them instead.
Why?
Well, he says that the elderly, instead of having possibilities in the future, have realities in the past.
Right.
The experiences they've had, the things they've accomplished, even the suffering they've endured, it's all real.
It's about acknowledging the richness of a life well lived.
Exactly.
Even if it includes hardship.
Even if it includes hardship. Exactly.
Yeah.
There's this sense of fulfillment that comes from having truly lived, from having faced life's challenges head on. And in the end, Frankl says, there's nothing to fear anymore except our God.
It's a statement that really reflects his deep spirituality.
Yeah.
And his belief in something larger than ourselves.
Absolutely.
So, wow, we've journeyed from the depths of human suffering in concentration camps to this profound understanding of meaning, guilt, and death.
We have. And Frankl's message, it's ultimately one of hope and resilience.
It is.
He shows us that even in the most extreme circumstances, we have the power to choose our attitude, to find meaning, and to live with purpose.
This deep dive it's been incredible, really thought-provoking. And, Frankl, he focuses a lot on individual meaning.
He does.
But I wonder, could his ideas be applied to collective suffering as well? Like, can a group, a nation, even humanity as a whole, find a shared purpose in times of hardship?
That's an excellent question. And honestly, I think it's something worth exploring further. Frankl's work offers this really valuable framework for understanding the human search for meaning, a search that, it transcends individual circumstances.
It connects us all.
Exactly.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into man's search for meaning. We hope it's inspired you to reflect on your own why, your own purpose in life, and to find meaning even in the face of challenges. Until next time, keep seeking.
Keep questioning.
Keep diving deep.